Okay, welcome back everyone. It is 12/14 of 2015, getting toward the end of the year here. We're going to begin a study in the Gospel of John, and I think I'll entitle it The Gospel of John for a New America, which means specifically the Gospel of John for New Americans, or the rebirth of the American vision, and what it means to be a human being in America. So, the Gospel of John for a New America, for New American rebirth. In this lesson, we want to take a look at background material. We want to take a look at a little bit of the situation surrounding the writing of the Gospel of John, and what prompted the writing of the Gospel of John, and what period of time are we looking at, and specifically where was it written. And all of these elements come into play because we find, when we get into the Gospel of John, that essentially we're looking at the final apostolic revelation from our Father in heaven to the church. It is the final apostolic revelatory vision given to the apostles. It's dated around AD 100, but it is the final revelatory apostolic message given by the Father. It actually comes after the book of Revelation. It comes after the vision, which prompted the writing of the book of Revelation. It comes after that vision. So actually, the end of the New Covenant ends with the final apostolic message being the Gospel of John, not the book of Revelation. And that is significant because the Gospel of John is very theological, and it's very much centered on the light of truth and the light of illumination that Jesus Christ brings. And it is very much a document that spoke very intentionally about opposing Gnosticism and other heresies, but anything that would suppress or take away from the incarnation of Jesus Christ as the incarnate divine Son of God, who was not only fully human and fully divine, but I mean both, fully divine and fully human together. And that was a concept that was alien to a few heresies that were evolving in first century Christianity and first century thought. The Gospel of John had to counter that. But it also is, obviously, it's the gospel of love. It's a reminder of the love of God. It's a reminder of the love of God being that which establishes and sustains the new covenant. It's a reminder of the new covenant. So essentially, our new covenant opens with the book of Acts, and it as the giving of the gift of the Holy Spirit. And then it's going to close with the final apostolic revelation being the Gospel of John. So it gives us a little bit of a different look. I mean, our New Testament does begin with the Gospels and ends with Revelation. So it is close, but essentially it's supposed to be beginning with the giving of the Spirit in the book of Acts and closing with the final apostolic revelatory message given to the Apostle John in AD 100. And that becomes a document that arrives and a vision that arrives after the revelation. So it's essential that we remember that our new covenant ends with a reminder of the love of God through the Gospel of John. So we're going to look at some background material here. We're going to take a look at this document on a historical background concerning the Gospel of John. And basically the authorship: John, the son of Zebedee, was the brother of James of Zebedee. And so basically, John the apostle, John the beloved, the one whom Jesus loved, is commonly considered the author of the Gospel of John, and also the author of the epistle of 1 John. However, there's dispute over the authorship of 2nd and 3rd John, and there's dispute over the authorship of the book of Revelation. But it's almost universally agreed that the Gospel of John and 1 John were most certainly written by John the Apostle, John the Beloved. It's only 2nd and 3rd John and the book of Revelation that are disputed, and many feel that possibly those documents were written by John the Elder, who was an elder in the church at Ephesus in Asia Minor. So there's dispute in those areas, but as far as the Gospel of John and 1 John, John the Apostle, John the Beloved is considered the author of the Gospel of John. With regarding date, the date falls somewhere between 73 and 100 AD or CE. And basically, the Jewish-Roman War took place between 66 and 73 CE, and it resulted in the complete destruction of the temple in AD 70, we know, and that forced a dispersion of the Jewish citizenship into Asia Minor, or in some instances, some voluntarily exiled themselves to the Qumran community, where we later discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you have the dispersion. You have the dispersion of the Christian faith being dispersed throughout Asia Minor, and specifically Ephesus, because Ephesus was a very flourishing city. It was a very wealthy city. It was a place where you could make a living, where you could sustain life and have a good life. And so it was a very favorable place to go. It was kind of an intersection of marketing and trade routes and seaports, and so it was a very, very rich city, and all of the areas in Asia Minor were very well off, much more so than Jerusalem. So this dispersion resulted in most of the Christian and Jewish citizenship moving to Ephesus in Asia Minor. Also, John ended up in Ephesus, and he went to Ephesus, and he was entrusted with the care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so he actually took Mary with him and went to Ephesus himself. And when the Jewish-Roman skirmish started its uprise, he took that opportunity to also migrate out of Jerusalem to Ephesus with Mary, the mother of Jesus. So there was a overall dispersion. There was an overall dispersion of the Jewish citizenship, and John the Apostle took Mary and also left for Ephesus as well. Now we need to look at a heresy that was arising, a mode of thought that was arising at that particular time, which was toward the end of the 1st century. And that was in Ephesus, there was a proto-Gnosticism just coming into birth. Now, Gnosticism really didn't become formally organized until the 2nd century, but at the end of the 1st century, we had a proto-Gnosticism on the rise. And coupled with that, there was the already existing problem of Judaizers, or the Ebionites, as we discussed when we discussed our commentary on the book of Acts. The Ebionites also dispersed and exiled themselves to Ephesus as well. So in Ephesus you had the Ebionites, or the Judaizers, who said that the law of Moses was an imperative for all converts, including Christian converts. They must adhere to the demands of the Jewish faith regardless. The Mosaic law applies. So you had the Judaizers still present, or the Ebionites, as they were called, and you had a proto-Gnosticism on the rise, and those two combined for Block 2 here, the Gnostic Ebionite beliefs. And we've got 14 listed here. They practiced ritual bathing, which was influenced by the Essenes. They developed a very complete angelology, a very complete doctrine of the emanation of angels that was very, very prevalent. Christ was considered an incarnation of an archangel who was adopted as the Son of God due to his righteousness. So Christ was adopted Son of God. According to the proto-Gnosticism, he was adopted Son of God, and he was an archangel. So he was the adopted Son of God who was an emanated angel. They practiced a vegetarian diet, and it was, of course, mandatory for all to obey the law of Moses. They only used the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. They were also known as Judaizers. They considered Paul an apostate. They didn't, even in spite of the Jerusalem Council, they still were very much in opposition to Paul. And some did voluntarily exile themselves to Qumran, where we later discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. They felt that the temple, prior to its destruction in AD 70, was corrupt by the Roman influence because Rome, the Roman governor, appointed the high priest, and it was actually a very, very corrupt office, and the entire priesthood became very corrupt. And these Ebionites did consider the temple to be corrupted by Rome. They all took a voluntary vow of poverty, but the Ebionites did start taking up a lot of the Gnostic aspects of belief. So they started a proto-Gnosticism kind of coupled itself to the Ebionites who had migrated from Jerusalem. Now salvation equaled awakening, and that awakening was to a higher spiritual gnosis truth. The Gnostics believed that there was a higher spiritual Gnostic truth for the illuminated that was not for the common man. There was a higher spiritual truth, a gnosis, that you could receive through ritual and through meditation and through the practice of becoming a Gnostic in their order. Now concerning Christ, they rejected the preexistence of Christ. They rejected any divinity in an earthly form, so they did not accept the fact that Christ was fully human. He appeared to be human to them, but he wasn't truly fully human. They didn't believe in the virgin birth. They didn't believe in any way possible that there could be a physical resurrection. And Christ was adopted the Son of God. He was not born and appointed Son of God. He was adopted Son of God due to his righteousness. So they very much rejected the idea of Jesus Christ possessing full divinity and full humanity. And that was the primary emphasis of the Gnostics. They were very much into spiritualism. They were very much into higher spiritual gnosis that could be mystically conveyed in a vision. You needed to join their order, go through their rituals, practice their meditations. You could receive this higher wisdom, this higher gnosis, but it was a very spiritual gnosis, and you would discover things like the order of the emanation of angels, and how the 30th emanation was the angel Demiurge, and Demiurge was the emanation that actually was the creator God, because God was so pure for the Gnostics that God cannot be the creator God. There had to be an emanation away from the true God that could be a creator God. So Demiurge was the 30th emanation. And in their mystical knowledge, that is why Jesus was around 30 years old when he started his ministry, because symbolically it pointed to the fact that the 30th emanation is the emanation where the Creator God created all of creation. But that was this higher truth, this higher gnosis, that a follower needed to acquire. And the scriptures were to be interpreted in a spiritualism and Christ was to be viewed and understood as a spiritualism. He only appeared to be human. He did not possess a true human nature. That was their heresy, and the Gospel of John was written against this heresy very specifically. And of course, 1 John also is very much directed against Gnosticism. But it was in its early stages. It was a proto-Gnosticism that was linking up with the Ebionites. Now, if we take a look at Block 3, 1st century Ephesus, the church and its encounter with false teachings, the heresies included that proto-Gnosticism and Jewish legalism. So Judaism mixed the early stages of Gnosticism, including that adherence to the Mosaic law, ritualism for the vision of angels, and that higher gnosis of wisdom. The higher gnosis included the fact that Jesus began his ministry at 30 years old because of the 30th emanation of the Demiurge, who was the Creator God. Jesus only seemed to have a finite body. And Jesus taught two doctrines, according to the Gnostics, the common teachings for the common man, but a higher teaching was there, a hidden one, a spiritually elite wisdom was available to those who were awakened. And there was no bodily resurrection. That was an impossibility for the Gnostics to believe in. Now there was also in Ephesus the presence of the Artemis cult that we learned of in Acts, which was the fertility goddess who blessed childbirth and the fruition of business, and was worshipped through temple prostitution in some instances. But the Artemis cult was very much the culture of Ephesus. It was very much centered around this fertility cult, and the silversmiths made many images of Artemis, and that's where Paul got in trouble when he ministered there and challenged these false silver idols. He was threatening their economy, and it almost resulted in his death. But the Artemis cult was very present. Proto-Gnosticism and the Ebionite Jewish legalism, or Judaizers, all of these heresies were very much present in Ephesus at the end of the 1st century, and John's gospel is directed toward these heresies that are present during this roughly around 95 to 100 AD. So if we look at Block 4, we're going to take a look at the Ephesus ministry and how it developed. In AD 52, Aquila and Priscilla and Apollos had already initiated the ministry there. They were getting things started. From AD 52 to AD 55, Paul arrived. He stayed for 2 years and 3 months. Sometimes people just say 3 years, but 2 years and 3 months Paul ministered there. He constantly struggled against opposition. He was actually imprisoned at Ephesus at one point because, remember, he was ministered to by Philemon. He wrote Corinthians, Galatians, and Philemon from Ephesus. He did have a huge conflict with the Artemis goddess and the silversmiths, which almost resulted in his death. And he left with his last sermon being given at the port of Miletus. It should be B-M-I, but Miletus. And the last sermon was given there to the elders of Ephesus, if we remember. So after the near-death encounter with the amphitheater and the goddess of Artemis, the followers threatened Paul. He escaped with his life. He said a farewell and gave a farewell sermon at Miletus port. And then between 55 and 64, and we don't know the exact time, but Simon Peter did minister in Asia Minor. All 7 areas, all 7 churches did receive ministering from Simon Peter. He did preaching there, but again it was the watering of the seed that had already been planted by Paul. So Paul planted seed. Simon Peter did follow up from 55 to 64 and did water that seed. And then the key moment, AD 64, the Apostle John the Beloved, arrives with Mary, the mother of Jesus. He formally founds the church at Ephesus. The church at Ephesus is accredited to John the Apostle. Now, he faced opposition also. He did found the church, but he was persecuted and he was exiled to the penal colony at the Isle of Patmos, and it's while he was on the Isle of Patmos that he wrote the book of Revelation around AD 85 to AD 95. He was exiled until Domitian, the emperor, died, and so that in note 2 there, he was released from exile in AD 96. He returned to Ephesus, and it was from 96 to 100, AD 96 to AD 100, that he actually wrote his gospel. And he wrote his gospel because all 7 bishops of the 7 churches in Asia Minor came to John and asked him. First, they explained that they did receive his revelation, and he very much criticized them for their failure of opposing these heresies. And John had given them the advice to return to the first things, return to the first fruits. And so this is on their mind, and they asked John to help us return to the first fruits. Will you please write your gospel? It was a request from the 7 bishops of the 7 churches in Asia Minor. John said, I will write my gospel if you will pray that I receive an apostolic vision like I had on the Isle of Patmos to inspire me in the way that I was inspired there, and I will write my gospel. And so this was the precondition, but John did agree to write his gospel. He wrote it between AD 96 and AD 100. It is the final, absolute final word in the New Testament of the apostolic truth given to the church and given to all believers. The last word from our living Father in heaven was not the revelation. The last apostolic revelation, the last apostolic illumination given to the church and given to the body of believers is the Gospel of John. So it's a tremendous study because we are studying the return to the first fruits. We are studying the return to the gospel of love. We are returning to the challenge against all heresies that challenge Jesus Christ as fully divine, fully human, our intercessor, our mediator to God, the true Christ Messiah and Lord over the living and the dead. We need to take this up and be reminded again. The Father's final apostolic vision to the church and to the believers is the Gospel of John. So John arrives there with Mary, and he is exiled to the Isle of Patmos. He's released, he writes his Gospel, and the church more or less believes that John's life was preserved this long as evidence of a miracle, because to live into your 70s, your 80s, at that time was very, very unusual because of all of the health issues, and there was not a lot of great longevity of life. But John's life was preserved. He lived to be very old, and he did write his gospel at a very mature level of his intellect, a very mature level of his emotion and intellect. So it is a very refined document, and it does differ from the writing of the book of Revelation because it's felt that the Revelation was written on the Isle of Patmos where John was by himself, but the belief is that when he returned to Ephesus, that at the writing of his gospel, he was given a scribe secretary to assist the compilation of the gospel. So the feeling is that there probably was some refinement of the gospel scroll compared to the Revelation scroll, because the Revelation scroll was written by hand by the Apostle John, whereas the Gospel of John could very well have been dictated to a scribe secretary, and there could have been some refinement of language in that way. That's one answer. I mean, another opinion is that the Revelation was written by John the Elder rather than John the Apostle. There are areas of debate there which have not been resolved as yet. They may never be resolved. But if we want to hold to the view that the Apostle John wrote both, then we can very much understand that on the Isle of Patmos, he was writing with his own hand. But in Ephesus, he, in all probability, was dictating the gospel to a scribe secretary. And if you notice, if you look at the little box at the bottom there, we've got the Revelation 2:5. This was the advice that John had written from the Isle of Patmos. Remember, therefore, from where thou art fallen, and repent, and do the first works. The Gospel of John is a writing of reminding the churches to do the first works. Return to the true gospel. Return to the gospel of illumination. Return to the person of Jesus Christ. Stay firm in this truth, in this aletheia truth. That gives us a very brief but a pretty good look at the early church in Ephesus and the proto-Gnosticism that was present.